We want to extend a heartfelt, warm welcome to everyone who has joined us. We are so delighted that despite all the other things you could be doing, you have prioritized this and you have chosen to participate in this momentous occasion, the first ever Belonging conversation of this magnitude, co-hosted by Northern Illinois University and the city of DeKalb, Illinois. I am your moderator for this evening. My name is Angela Barron Jeffrey. My husband, Michael, and I moved to DeKalb in the early 90s as graduate students and have been a part of the NIU and DeKalb community ever since. I served as an administrator at NIU for over 20 years and continue to serve as the assistant pastor of the first church founded by African Americans in the city of DeKalb. Tonight, we are here to initiate a conversation of belonging, a conversation that needs to occur, a conversation that should have occurred in the past, but it's never too late and it's a great place to start. We have invited, and he has agreed to join us, Dr. John Powell, and he will provide us an understanding of belonging and othering. After Dr. Powell shares his presentation with us, he will respond to questions from a panel of 8 members. I gotta tell you that the panel is comprised of 8 of the over 40 community stakeholders who have worked diligently together to coordinate tonight's event. And we are so grateful that they have done that. Our evening is an evening of hope. It is an evening of beginning, but it will not stop at the end of this conversation because we anticipate that this will start ongoing conversation and action on belonging. Some homework, housekeeping. For all of you who have attended this webinar, and I understand it's over 500 people, which demonstrates a level of interest that we are so happy to have. We value your input as participants in this process, and we invite you to submit questions in the Q&A. While we may not have the time for Dr. Powell to respond to every question in the Q&A, considering the fact that there'll probably be quite a lot of them, please note that we intend to follow up with it. And so following this event, registered attendees will receive an email with a short survey that we ask that you take a few minutes to complete. We expect that you will receive feedback to this within 2 to 3 weeks after the event, at which time answers to questions will be posted on the City of DeKalb Belonging webpage. We also plan to put plans into place to address actions that have emerged. We want you to participate actively as you continue in the ongoing conversation, to also participate as part of the team who creates the agenda for the action that moves us towards belonging. So again, we thank you. I do not want to occupy a lot of time for the time of our wonderful auspicious presenter. So without much further ado, I'm going to move to talking about the co-hosts of this event, the university, Northern Illinois University, and the city of DeKalb have collaborated to do this. And we have 2 faces that represents each of these entities. One is Dr. Vernice Edgel Walden. Dr. Vernice joined NIU as the Chief Diversity Officer in 2015, and it was the first time that NIU has had that position. She currently serves, though, as the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she actually wears the dual hats because she serves as the Interim Chief Human Resource Officer. Dr. Walden is a creative implementer, leading the university initiatives by aligning policies and practices between human resources and diversity, equity, and inclusion that improve NIU's hiring process access, academic equity, inclusion, professional development, and training for faculty, staff, and students. I have had the opportunity over the short period that she has been here to spend time with her. She's a very warm, personable person who really has a passion, not only for the work, but for the people. Welcome.
Thank you, Angela. I am excited to be a part of this important conversation about inclusion and belonging. It's important to me as a woman of color and a resident of DeKalb, and also a member of the NIU senior leadership team, that we take action to create a sense of belonging and community so that we can live and learn and work together in DeKalb. We live in a world that says that you are either on either one side or another. But our conversation this evening is the next step on an actionable path to build a community where our differences become our strengths. I would like to acknowledge at this time that the land on which Northern Illinois University operates is built on the traditional lands of the indigenous people. And tonight we seek to honor the legacies and struggles and the existence of these indigenous people. Acknowledging them or speaking about one group of people does not diminish other groups, but acknowledging the harm, we can then begin to heal and build inclusivity in our community. I would like to thank my co-host, Bill Nicholas, and the City of DeKalb for partnering with us to host tonight's conversation. It's really important that you know that we started this conversation about bringing Dr. Powell to DeKalb in January, pre-COVID-19 and the increased racial unrest across the country. We knew we needed to have a community conversation that provided us with actionable steps to bring our community together. We knew that Dr. Powell, a national expert, was someone who could engage us in this conversation. Given all that has happened and continues to happen in our country, we know that we both Bill and I knew that we needed to do this community conversation even more. We are so glad to have Dr. Powell to be able to join us virtually. It's important that we hear from our community members in DeKalb, from diverse voices, from longtime residents, from students, and from people in our community, from new community members. I know this discussion is going to inspire ideas and encourage action. And since this is a virtual event, I want to invite you to join this conversation virtually by using the hashtag #BelongingDeKalb. Share pictures and ideas for tonight's discussion on social media. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Vernice. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Nicholas, the city manager in the city of DeKalb. I'm very proud to join my friend and tireless colleague, Vernice Edgell-Walden, in welcoming Dr. Powell and all participants in tonight's event. It's important to me as a longtime resident of DeKalb to be a part of a conversation about building a more inclusive community. One of my professional duties as a city manager is to explain to individuals and families and businesses what they can expect as they consider working or residing or investing in our community. It has never been more apparent to me that the conventional community development focus, the clean air, the relatively inexpensive land, clean water, good schools, so on and so forth, is woefully inadequate to describe the community we want to belong in. The social justice movement that has very positively energized the dialogue about racism in our country and also in this community has also helped us engage one another in finding what unites and also what humanizes us. Tonight, we take another step in that process of listening and learning and becoming more familiar. In a long career of public service, I have learned that familiarity builds respect, and mutual respect is very essential for trust. As one of over 500 persons gathered tonight, I virtually join hands with tonight's speaker and our diverse community in the further exploration of how we can better embrace one another as we work and as we learn and as we live together.
Thank you so much for that warm, heartfelt, solid, and actually very accurate and timely expression of what we need to be doing at the university and in our city, because we share common space, we share a common people. And it's really, really wonderful to see both the city manager and one of the top administrators at my university coming together to do this. Go NIU and go City of DeKalb. A little bit about Bill that was not mentioned is that this is 2020 marks about 50 years since he entered the DeKalb community. He moved here in 1970 as a graduate student, where he attained a master's and PhD in American history. And subsequently, after having pursued other paths of passion, such as carpentry, he has served the DeKalb and Sycamore community, which both are located in the county of DeKalb, for 25 years as a city manager for DeKalb and then subsequently for Sycamore. Took a stint, spent a few years at NIU as administrator, spent a few years at Kishwaukee College, and now back serving in his 50th year in DeKalb as our city manager, and we are grateful for you. Some of the points you mentioned is the fact that you have learned that when we seek unity, we begin to, you said humanizing, and I would say rehumanize one another, because anything outside of justice and equity dehumanizes both the recipient and those who are administering injustice. And so we are grateful for the opportunity to listen and learn tonight as we continue to develop both the language and the passion for the dialogue of belonging. So we have invited Dr. Powell, who has a very extensive bio, which I am not going to read all of it, but I will highlight a few points in it. Dr. Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, a research institute that brings together scholars, community advocates, communicators, policymakers to identify and eliminate barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to create transformative change toward a more equitable world. He has written extensively on a number of these issues, as well as issues such as opportunity-based housing, voting rights, affirmative action in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil, racial and ethnic identity, spirituality, social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society. He also founded and directed the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. He has lived and worked both in Africa, where he was a consultant to the governments of Mozambique and South Africa, and has also worked in India and Brazil. So he brings to us an extensive, not just American, but international perspective of othering and belonging, one in which he has seen othering and belonging, not just as it pertains to race in America, but as it pertains to nationalism, as it pertains to age, as it pertains to identity. And so without further ado, we will welcome Dr. Powell. And Dr. Powell, in welcoming you, I have been given the task of asking you the first question of the evening that sort of sets the tone for what you are going to present. So we will start off by asking you to explain the concept of belonging and othering and why this is such a fundamental dialogue for us to be having at this time.
Well, thank you, Angela, and thank your communities. I know it's really one community, but some are in the university and some are living in the city. And first of all, I'm gonna ask if it's possible, and it may not be possible at this late date, if you could arrange it so I can share my screen so I can show you some slides. If you can't, that's all right, I can go forward without it. But if you can, that would be great. I have the Institute is a large institute, and the Institute, I came to Berkeley from the Ohio State University, right down the road from you guys. And I'm the founding director. And the Institute is large, and we look at all kinds of marginality, from race to disability, to religion, to age, to sexual orientation. And I think they have, if I'm correctly, they're allowing me to share my screen with you so I can show you when I'm.
Dr. Powell, you may go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Can you see that? Can you see building? Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Dr. Powell, we're not able to see it at home.
Okay. All right. So if you can't see that, I won't use it.
We cannot, Dr. Powell.
Okay. Let me get back where I can see you. So as Angela suggested, all of these things, whether you look at disability, whether you look at how we think about nationality, how we think about age, basically, this is one of the sort of huge divides. It's the ways we basically are saying some people belong and some people don't belong. And this is not just an issue in the United States, it's an issue literally all over the world. We divide people up. Some people think it's innate in human nature to divide people up, but it's not just dividing people. We go on to say that some people belong and some don't. And so I'll make the PowerPoint available to you. I have a little video in it. And in a sense, this is the global problem. These issues are being exacerbated all over the world, whether India, Germany, South Africa, Brazil. The question that's in literally every country's struggling right now around who belongs and who does not belong. And an interesting question is, why now? Why is this question so prominent in the 21st century? And it's actually, there are a number of reasons. It can't just be tied to the dynamics of what's happening here in the United States. It also speaks to us traveling, that people move. There are somewhere over 300 million people who live outside of their country of birth. We have air travel. So in a sense, the world is becoming smaller. And as it becomes smaller, we're becoming increasingly aware of its diversity. And so in many sense, to paraphrase W.B. Du Bois, the problem of the 21st century is the problem of othering. And if we don't get it right, everything's at risk, including the nation state itself. So when I looked at all these different expressions of marginality, we came to the phrase othering and belonging. That what we're seeing are practices of people being othered, to, in some sense, saying you're less than, you're not a full member, you're sometimes a provisional member, sometimes not a member at all. And people are fighting against that. People are trying to challenge that. And so you have that dynamic of othering and belonging. I'd also like to just nudge you a little bit. When I first came to UC Berkeley, which is where the Institute is, we were using pretty much the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we moved to belonging and bridging. And I want to say why and invite you to think about that in terms of your work. It's not just a change in name, it's a change really in orientation. So if you think about the way most people practice inclusion, it's actually where you're including someone in something that already exists. You're including people as a guest, and to sort of come to your university, come to your city, and basically adjust to all of the norms and practices and institutions that already exist. I use the example I oftentimes use is, it's like I have a party, and I'd love to have a party in your presence where many of you could join, but it's my party. And it's my party, it's my music, it's my food, it's my friends, and you're welcome. But don't bring your own food there. Don't bring your own friends there. Don't bring your own music there. It's my party, and so you can have a good time, and then you leave. That's inclusion. That's the way we largely practice inclusion, where we invite someone to our institution, to our company, to our city, but the norms, the structure, the artwork, the culture is ours, and they're expected to adjust to all of those. And it strikes me that as useful as that is, and that can be a useful move, it's also limited, because people don't want to just be a guest. They actually want to contribute. They actually want to bring their full self. And that actually leads us into belonging. Belonging, and I'll say more about this later, is not simply where you join something that's already there. It's where you're also invited to help co-create its future. You become part of the thing that you're joining. It becomes an expression of you. Now, as you sort of co-create with others, you don't get to co-create it just for yourself. You have to co-create it for all the people who are already there, all the people who might come after you, but you have more of a role than just as a guest. So now it's our party. We pick the music, we pick the food, we pick the furniture, we pick the guest list. Now that's an awesome thing, but it's also a lot of responsibility. It means that we have to step up in a different way. So that's one of the reasons we shifted from inclusion to belonging. And again, I would like for you to at least consider that in your work at Northern Illinois University and your wonderful city. So what is othering anyway? What does that mean? That's a funny word, a wonky word. Othering basically just means where in various forms someone does not have full standing. And the standing can be modest, where they're not allowed to participate, they're not allowed to speak. If they speak, they have to speak in my language. They have to express themselves through my culture. In a sense, in an academic sense, we can say there's a normativity that they have to adhere to. And I often tell the story of James Baldwin, who was one of my favorite teachers. And James Baldwin, at the height of his literary career, he was asked to join this august literary society. And he was very excited about this. He had been looking forward for this for years. And so he's delighted that he had been recognized. And they said, Mr. Baldwin, we recognize you as a really wonderful writer, and we'd like you to join. There's a couple of conditions, though. So one of them is, we know you hang out with riffraff. And that was really a term for people of color, and particularly Blacks, that a lot of your friends are riffraff. And they really wouldn't be appropriate to have those people at our club. And we also know, that you're gay. Don't remind us of that. It was an early expression of don't ask, don't tell. So don't remind us that you're gay, and we won't ask you about being gay. And James Baldwin declined the offer to join under those conditions. He left the country somewhat brokenhearted, went to France, went to Paris, and wrote a book called The Price of the Ticket. And what he was saying is that the price of belonging, the price of membership was too high. And sometimes under the rubric of inclusion, the price to be included is too high. Belonging doesn't ask people to give up who they are. It doesn't ask them to hide their identities. It asks them to come with their full self and participate in creating something where we all belong. Now, in the context of belonging, not all of us have the same power, and so there's a power differential. I'll come back to that. And I will say that one of the ways you create a space for belonging, or container of belonging, is through stories. And the stories are particularly resonant of those who are leaders in the community. And it can be formal leaders or informal leaders. What are the stories we tell about ourselves, about others, about our community? How do other people show up in our stories? Do they get to participate in telling stories themselves? And as we sort of go through rapid change creates anxiety, not just in humans, but also in animals. You think about Darwin. Darwin talks about survival of the fittest, and that can be understood in multiple ways. But one of the things he's saying is that those who can sort of adapt to the environment have the best chance of surviving. We're going through a lot of change right now, not just in the United States, but in the world. And these changes happen in many areas: climate change, globalization, demographics, economics, technology. And these changes are speeding up. And some social scientists worry that the change is actually putting stress on us as human beings. And this change creates anxiety because we can't navigate this by ourselves. And so in DeKalb, you might say, the university had all these people from all over the world coming to our community. And how do we deal with that? Is it still our community? This has changed. In a sense, that anxiety is something, again, that happens not just in DeKalb, it happens all over. Rapid change creates stress, creates anxiety. And we look to leaders to help us navigate that change. And those leaders help us by telling stories, by creating structures, by creating capacity. And so there are two major stories to deal with this change. One of them is the story of fear. Yes, your community is changing. It doesn't look like it used to look. It doesn't sound like it used to sound. There's strange food, there's strange habits that you're not used to. What's the response? So one story is you should be afraid. You should be afraid of those people bringing this change with them. They are the other. We call that breaking. And so breaking is where you actually organize and exaggerate the difference of other people and minimize our commonality. So that's one story. It's a story that there's this set, small we that can't deal with or accommodate the other. Or a more gentle version of that is that the other can come to our community, but they have to adhere to all the rules, norms, and practices that we already set up. That's a soft kind of breaking, but it's still breaking nonetheless. A more extreme form would be they can't come at all. Let's exclude them. And the way we have historically organized space around segregation, for example, is one example of that. But there's another story. There's a story which is that, yes, they're bringing something different, but they're potentially expanding the circle of human concern. They're expanding our taste in food. They're creating new possibilities, not for them, but for all of us. And so we're creating this larger we. The we is not set. The we is constantly being redefined. And who's in that we is constantly being redefined. In order to create this larger we need to have practices, stories, institutions that acknowledge that we're situated differently, that we have different experiences. And I've talked about people coming, but this is not just people coming from overseas. If you think about women coming into the workforce in the 1970s, it created much of the same stress because the workforce had been organized around the practice of men. And when women came in, which had a different practice, but they weren't strangers, they weren't coming from a different country, they were coming from, more often than not, from home. But they were coming with a different practice, a different understanding, and it took a while for the country to adjust to it. And it's still adjusting to it some. But one would, on balance, say that that shift was a positive shift, not just for women, work for all of us. This can be measured. There's a woman named Susan Fisk, who's a professor at Princeton. She has something called the stereotype content model. So there's two axes in terms of how we interact with people. One axis is called how warm you feel towards someone, how much you like them. The other axis is how competent you think someone is. And with that, you create 4 squares. And so you could think you like someone a lot and they're super competent. That's the gold standard. You could like someone, but not think they're very competent. You could dislike someone and think they're competent, or you could dislike someone and think they're incompetent. And with these 4 squares, she actually tests people, both at a verbal level, but also by linking people up so she can measure what's happening in the brain. And so people who are seen as competent and we like them tend to represent the dominant culture in whatever setting it is. So if we were in Turkey, it would be people who are Muslim. And she has done this all over the world. And the United States historically has been white men. And she looks at where people fall within these 4 squares. And so, for example, the elderly and women tend to fall into the square of, we like them, but they're not that competent. Asians tend to fall into the square of, we think they're competent, but we really don't like them that much. These are national samples, so they're not talking about individuals. But then poor people, Blacks, returning citizens tend to fall into the category of, we don't like them, and we don't think they're very competent. Now, there's a lot of research around this, and I'll just highlight 2 things. There's a part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being. It doesn't mean you're going to take them home with you. It doesn't mean you're going to get their phone number. Nature thought it would be kind of cool if we just recognize members of our species, fellow species. When you don't like someone, and this is all at an unconscious level, and you don't think they're very competent, that part of the brain does not light up. At an unconscious level, we don't see some people as fully human. So people who are sometimes homeless, we oftentimes, as a national sample, don't see those people as human. And I've written about this, basically saying we can't develop effective policy for people who we don't see as human. So this is extreme kind of othering. And when people are not seen as human, not only do we make bad policy for those people, but we also tell stories about them. We symbolically deny them. It has an effect both in terms of how we treat them, but also how they experience themselves. And so it has medical consequences. It has consequences in terms of how well someone performs on a job. There are just, again, many, many studies, and maybe if there's time, we can get into some of these in the questions period. But when you deeply other someone, you actually create trauma in the person's body and in their mind. And in a sense, you create trauma in society. And so this is a serious issue, again, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States, and certainly, I would say, in DeKalb and at Northern Illinois University. So what we try to do when we hear about othering, we think that many of us who want to be, decent human beings, we have a value, many of us, of being fair and treating people equally. So when we hear about people being othered, we think the solution is to same, what I call saming. We think the solution to othering is to same. And that is to say, I don't notice your race. I don't notice your ethnicity. I don't notice your gender. I'm just looking at an individual. 2 things. First of all, at an unconscious level, it doesn't work that way. That may be what you're doing at the conscious level, but the unconscious is like, okay, you might not notice them, but we're noticing. And those who who study the mind science know that the unconscious is big, it's fast, and it's unwieldy. You can't shut it down, and we can demonstrate that empirically. So if the problem then with othering can't be solved through saming, how is it solved? It's solved or addressed through belonging. So we notice that people have different life outcomes. We notice that people are situated differently in society. We notice that, and we notice sometimes just in the people, but sometimes we notice in the data. So take COVID that we're dealing with right now. Many of us probably will never go to a reservation. But when we look at the data, we see that indigenous people are having a much different experience than their white counterparts living in other parts of America. The data is telling us that something is going on that's different. And again, when we hear about these group differences, we make two moves. One move is to say, so what's wrong with Native Americans? What's wrong with them as people? The other move is to say, are there some structures, are there some systems that actually situate them differently, that produce those different outcomes that we should attend to? If you make the first assertion, that is blaming them, you're likely not to do anything except to say they need to change. If you make the second assertion, you then start looking to see how people are situated. And just to give you one concrete example, the CDC says one of the ways to deal with this treacherous virus is to wash your hands several times a day. Every time you go outside and come back inside, wash your hands. Turns out, no one knows the exact number, but between 40 and 50% of the people living on the Navajo reservation, which is the largest reservation in the United States, don't have access to running water. So the very mechanism that we would use to address the issue is not available to them. And when we start to look at this, we see this over and over again. I was very active when Hurricane Katrina struck in New Orleans. And right after it struck, you may remember, there were pictures of Blacks stuck on top of roofs where the water was rising. And again, there was a story with it. So the stories are always important. And the first story was, what's wrong with Black people? And the answer that was being suggested is that they're contrary. We knew the hurricane was coming. It's not an earthquake. We could predict that the hurricane was coming. And we told people, there's a hurricane coming. First of all, we had told them that many times when we were wrong. But secondly, we said, get in your car and drive to your relative's house somewhere far away from the hurricane. And if you don't have a relative, get a hotel. Why didn't Black people leave? Again, when we looked at it, we found out that between 35 and 40% of African Americans living in the New Orleans area didn't have access to cars and or credit cards. So this strategy we had in terms of moving forward was created on a certain kind of normativity. It was based on a certain set of assumptions. And what we did with those assumptions is we racialized them. We said, it's the people themselves. It's not how they're situated. We othered them, if you will. And so there are different ways of not knowing. And one way of not knowing is some things we just can't know. You can't know how many neurons are firing in your brain right now. We don't have access to that information directly. Another way of not knowing is that we don't want things to know things that don't fit our narrative. I don't want to know about those people. So we close ourselves out to them. A third is that we're distracted. There's just too much going on. And then final is that some things we just refuse to know. So what I'm suggesting in terms of othering and belonging is that we move to actually knowing each other. We move to actually listening to each other. And we become very conscious of the stories we tell, of the narratives that we tell about each other. And who's telling the story, who's not telling the story. There's a South African word called sawubona. What sawubona means is that I see you. And it doesn't mean I physically see you. It means, by some accounts, we see you. It's a Zulu expression. It means the God in me sees the God in you. I see the divine in you. And the response is, I am here. And so part of it is that we all need to be seen. And to be seen is not to be just seen in our physical form right now, but it's actually talks about, I see your ancestors. I see all those that came before you. I really see you. And so one of the antidotes to othering is to really see people, not just to recognize them, but to see people. And when we see people, we start to acknowledge and see the full humanity. So belonging. Belonging is an interesting word, and sometimes people think of the word very narrowly, so I want to add a little substance to it. I will just note to you, I didn't say meat, I'm a vegetarian. And I only point that out because our concepts, whatever we're comfortable in, have certain valence, have certain energy, have certain values associated with it. They're not neutral. They reflect some aspect of our own experience. So anyway, adding substance to this. So belonging requires agency, power, responsibility, and care, and the capacity to co-create. So sometimes these things are missing. And so we can't belong if we don't have agency. We can't belong if we don't have the requisite power to actually participate. And we can't belong or create a belonging culture unless we care, both about ourselves, but also about the thing we're joining and the other people who are belonging. And this takes us to an interesting space. Oftentimes when we talk about race, we get into a fight about who's responsible for the racial condition. And even if we say Blacks or Latinos or other groups of color are not doing well, it's like, well, that has nothing to do with me. If I'm a white person, I didn't put things in place. First of all, belonging says we're all responsible. Now again, the responsibility is not symmetrical. So the person who's a head of a university or head of a company, they have more responsibility. You have more power, you have more capacity. It also means you have more responsibility. But none of us are relieved of responsibility. All of us have to share in the creating space of responsibility. So now we've moved from equality to equity to inclusion to belonging. Now, oftentimes when we talk about belonging, we talk about it in a personal way. How am I treating you? How do I see you? And that's important. But belonging also is about how we organize structures themselves. We all live in structures and structures live in us, but not the same. And structures are doing some work. And so we have to think about the structures as well. And I have a picture in this PowerPoint, which you can't see. I'm from Detroit. And in this picture, I have the Renaissance Center. So those of you who've been to Detroit know the Renaissance Center is the headquarters of General Motors. They're large cylinders and they represent pistons. Now, when the Renaissance Center was built, it was owned by Ford. And because Detroit was a struggling community, Ford built it like a fortress. It was hard to get in. There were all kinds of barricades. It was like, how do we actually separate ourselves from the city, from this struggling city? It was creating a breaking expression. It was saying, you don't belong in a Renaissance Center. This is a nice, shiny building, literally, and you're part of a dysfunctional city that's also primarily Black. Eventually, General Motors bought the Renaissance Center, and they did just the opposite. They said, we want to create a space where we're part of the city. And so they took down all the barriers and they created boardwalks and places welcoming the community. So when you think about the city, and when you especially think about the city and the university, oftentimes there's tension between town and gown. And some of the tension is demographic. Towns tend to be older and more permanent. The gown or university tends to be younger, sometimes more diverse and more transient. They need each other. Oftentimes, the university is spending a lot of money in the town, but there's also this tension, and there's different ways of dealing with this tension. Do you create a Ford Renaissance Center, or do you create a General Motors Renaissance Center? Do you create a porous thing where the structures and the culture allows for bridging, support bridging, or do you wall off and try to protect yourself, creating breaking? Belonging is something, those of you who remember Maslow, he said it was our third most important need after our physical needs, physiological needs, safety, then belonging. His students have inverted that. They're saying that you don't get food or safety unless you belong. Belonging actually goes beyond food and safety, though. There was a study done at UT Austin. They had a program of inviting Black and Latino students in, something called the 10% Plan. And it was fairly successful. They had a number of Black and Latino students coming in, but they weren't performing. And the university spent literally millions of dollars trying to remediate these students who they felt like, well, they're not quite up to the UT Austin standard. And then one professor called in these students, some of these Black and Latino students who weren't graduating in 5, 6, even 7 years, and talked to them about what it meant. How did it feel being at UT Austin? That's an interesting story. UT Austin had recruited me to come teach there and start an institute there some years ago. And when I got there, my host was explaining to me that all the memorabilia of Confederate statues and soldiers, and reminding me, yes, we fought on the side of the South in the Civil War. In fact, remember the Alamo? Well, most of us don't really remember the Alamo, but the Alamo was really a pro-slavery fight. It was trying to keep Texas away from Mexico, not just for nationalism, but because to protect slavery. And the host was acknowledging, yes, this is our history, and our history is our present. It's reflected in the name of our buildings. It's reflected in our memorabilia. And then he said, but don't pay attention to it. You know, we're a liberal campus. And even as he said that, I knew that my unconscious was on overdrive. Like, get the hell out of here. Why would you stay here? And I knew also that the Black and Latino students were probably having a similar experience and couldn't articulate it. Anyway, the point that I'm making is that once this discussion happened about belonging and the students said they didn't belong, having the discussion itself led them to a space where they much more likely felt like they did belong, and their performance shot up. Their performance shot up so fast and so high that a lot of researchers thought Texas must be cooking the books. Those Black and Latino students couldn't be performing as on par with the white students. Even in some cases, they exceeded the white students. And what they eventually came up with is that it's not that the students didn't have the academic capacity, they didn't have a sense of belonging. And that distracted them from doing well. Since then, there have been hundreds of studies like that, some of them captured in a book by Claude Steele called Whistling Vivaldi, and something he calls Stereotype Threats. Basically, and he doesn't just do it with Blacks and whites, he does it with men, he does it with women. Anytime you don't feel like you belong, and especially when you're deeply othered, it affects your performance and it affects your health. So one of the things I want to leave you with is the need to not only create a space of belonging, going even beyond inclusion, but also being aware if our activity is breaking or bridging. There's much more I could say, but I won't, because for the sake of time. But many of the practices we engage in are actually breaking practices. And we need to learn how to bridge. We need to become better at it, tell stories, be able to listen. And bridging with someone doesn't mean you agree with them, but it does mean you acknowledge and you hold on to their humanity. When I introduced this idea to a friend of mine, Pastor Michael McBride, he asked me, he's an African-American pastor here in the Bay Area. He said, so John, are you saying I need to bridge with the devil? And my response was, don't start there. Start with something that's more doable. Start with short bridges. Don't start with the most difficult, but also be careful who you call the devil. And so as we practice bridging, we need to think about how we begin to do it. And where are the short bridges? Don't start with the most difficult. There also needs to be a container. And the university or the city could actually help with these containers, having bridging practices, having bridging performance, having narratives where everyone is included. And this is happening across the country now. We're doing some of it at Berkeley. There are other cities that are talking about how do we become belonging cities. I know that's something that's come up in Rockford. And when you look at it, they become very concrete things that you might pursue. And again, part of belonging is co-creating. So how do you make sure that all the voices are at the table? When we other someone around any particular axis, that identity becomes the most important identity to that group. So part of the salience of a group identity is actually in response to being deeply othered. When that identity is less under attack, we find people actually soften not saying that identity goes away, but they're softened in it. So how do we build bridges? And I often cite my friend Bell Hooks, who says, bridges are made to walk on. And by that she means when you reach across to some group that's apparently different, you're likely to be challenged by the group you're reaching out to, and likely to be challenged by the group you're reaching from. Why are you interacting with that group? They're not like us. And so it's not always a comfortable space to hold. And maybe it's not for everyone, at least not initially. How do we organize structures, whether it's physical space, whether it's cultures, whether it's hearings, to make sure that people have a chance to belong? And we've done some of this, but we need to be much more attentive to it. And who has the power to help create these powerful expressions of bridging and belonging, these powerful stories? Again, all of us have power, but it's not evenly distributed. And it shifts from one situation to the other. How do we use this power to create belonging? I have a couple more slides, then we'll actually put up some curtains because the sun is coming up. Then I'll come back. But we all have multiple identities. When we other people, we flatten their identity. We don't see them in their complexity. They just become one thing. They get, whether it's a black man or white man or gay or straight, and we're all of those things. And the importance of them shift from each situation. When I go home, I become the youngest of 4 boys. Well, you can tell by looking at me, I'm not all that young. But when I go home, that identity becomes the salient identity again. When I leave home, that identity melts away and another identity becomes more important. So part of a healthy society allows people to move and acknowledge their fluidity. But when we other people and when we break with people, we flatten them. We don't see the complexity in which people, and we don't see our own complexity. So how do we create a space where everyone is heard? There's something called GARE, which is Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which I started with a colleague about 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. And it's huge. It's, I think, almost 300 governments now participating in it. And they're in relationship with each other. They create peer-to-peer learning, and it's very conceptual, but it's also very practical. It's very down to earth, and it's been quite successful. And I would encourage to think about this in the context of belonging. And that's starting. We're just at the beginning of that now. How do you create peer learnings? How do you learn what they're doing in Berlin? How do you learn what they're doing in Lincoln, Nebraska? How do you learn from each other about belonging. And how do you build trust? And then there are groups that have expressions of this. There's a group called Welcoming America, which does some of this work. They started just with immigrants. How do you welcome immigrants into neighborhoods? How do you say you belong to this neighborhood? But now they've expanded beyond that. And we're doing some work with them as well. And how do you do it at different levels? At the personal level, strategic level, organizational level, the cultural level. And realize that this is hard work, but it's good work, and it can be fun work. So let's not make it all dreary. Let's actually have fun. As we learn to bridge, as we learn to belong, as we learn to open up and be vulnerable, there's also joy, and that party becomes not a metaphor, but a real thing. So with that, I'll stop and get the sun out of my eyes and then open it up. And I think we're going to have questions and answers. So if you just give me 1 minute, I'll take care of the sun.
So while you are taking your minute to take care of the sun, we thank you for the light that you have brought to us this evening. It is amazing. I mean, you covered so many things. And I actually started taking voluminous notes, which I'm sure will be helpful to me as I continue my work here in our community on belonging and othering. And I hope that others, the rest of us, the rest of our 500 participants like me have gained something from this. Wow. So I had a question here about how do we begin to, why is this such a fundamental topic for DeKalb NIU? But I actually want to shift that. So, and instead begin to invite the panelists to ask you questions, because the questions that they ask you actually already begin to tell us how it could be fundamentally, not just instrumental to our communities, but how we could begin to look at moving it to the communities. So people, all of our participants, this is a time for you to continue to submit questions and answers in the Q&A. Remember that the only questions that will be answered tonight are questions that are directed to Dr. Powell. Questions that may be directed to anybody else, the other panelists, as well as the co-host, NIU, the City of DeKalb, that you may have. They are salient. Please ask them and know that you will get answers posted to you sometime, as I've said earlier, within 2 to 3 weeks after this on the DeKalb City of Belonging webpage. We will send out information regarding that along with the short survey that we're going to ask you to fill out. I am assuming that Dr. Powell has had a sip of water and has modified the sunlight that's coming into his wonderful home in California while we are sitting in the dark in DeKalb. So as previously mentioned, 40 members, stakeholders of our NIU and DeKalb community have been pondering on this for a while and have helped to organize this. And they actually have 8 representatives, each who will pose a question to you tonight. And so I'm going to introduce the person who is posing question 1. On our panel is my pastor, the Reverend Dr. G. Joseph Mitchell, probably known in the work world as George and in the community as Joe. So Reverend Dr. G. Joseph Mitchell, he is pastor of New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, has lived most of his life, grew up here in DeKalb, is a son of the soil here in DeKalb, has been very active in our community, is the incoming president of the DeKalb County Community Foundation, as well as his myriad of other things that he's involved in our community. Welcome, Joe. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Dr. Powell, it has been fruitful to sit at your feet and to glean from your work and from your wisdom. I texted a member of the church about 15 minutes ago and told them that you just gave me the foundation for my next sermon. So I appreciate that. So here is my question to you. DeKalb has various individuals and families who live, who work, and to go to school in this community. How do we bring people together who have different worldviews to engage and to learn about each other and truly create a sense of belonging?
Thank you. Great question. So I think you've already started, this meeting itself, and the fact that you got 500 people signing up. And my guess is they're not all the same. They're not on any particular spectrum, homogeneous. And people have started doing this around the country. I mean, literally in Manchester, the cities actually bring people together. They have meetings. Of course, we can't do that with COVID right now. But you could have discussions, bring, again, sort of virtual discussions. You could have, as you said, in your sermon, it could be reflected there. Churches have done that historically. I mean, that was part of the really wonderful experimentation out of the civil rights movement, where people literally started living together and worshiping together. And so the thing that's tricky about it, Reverend Mitchell, is that when you first do it, it feels kind of awkward. And I compare it to, you're in a stream that's flowing fairly fast. If you relax, you go along with the stream, right? You don't have to do anything, just sit there and the stream carries you along. If you decide that the stream was carrying you to the wrong place and you want to go upstream, initially, you got to work really hard because you're swimming against the stream. And we live in a society now that's deeply, deeply polarized, where breaking has been taken to a fine art, where we have social media that's been captured by those who want to break, where we have a call-out culture. For the past several years, not just here in the United States, but around the world, we've been flexing our breaking muscles. So when we first start practicing our bridging muscles, they're going to be weak, and we're going to make mistakes. So part of it is giving ourselves that capacity. And frankly, I would say as you venture into the journey, you'll find some joy, but also you may look for help. Just like in the DEI place now, there are a lot of people who they care about this, but there are also people who study it and who bring more attention to it. You won't be surprised to know that one of the leads in this work are belonging circles that are actually practiced by the faith community. And they've had thousands of belonging circles where they bring people of different faiths and people who have no faith to come together and in a curated way to have these belonging experiences and belonging conversations. So there actually is already a lot out there, and you can sort of pick what's appropriate for you. But I think first is sort of the intentionality. And like I said, I think probably the very nature that you're having this suggests that you're already started.
Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you so much, Pastor Joseph Mitchell and Dr. Powell. Our second panelist is Mike Pitsley, who is a local landlord here in DeKalb and who wanted to make sure that we let people know that he raised his family here in DeKalb, which speaks volumes of who he is and what he perceives as important, that he raised his family here. He's an active member also of the Annie Glidden Neighborhood Revitalization Effort. Mike, welcome.
Welcome, and welcome, Dr. Powell. My question tonight is, how do we help members of our community to begin recognizing their privilege and understanding how it impacts othering for those who do not share the same standing within our community?
Thank you. Great question. And actually, I'm sure this is true of all the questions. We could probably spend a day just sort of unpacking that and thinking about how to go into that very deeply. So a couple of things. I think what I do, oftentimes when I work with communities, institutions and cultures privilege and normalize some groups at the expense of other groups. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. For example, you can't tell now, I'm sitting down and, when I was young, I was probably close to 6'5". I'm now down to 6'2.5". But here's an expression of privilege. For every inch as a man, for every inch you occur over 6 feet, your lifetime income goes up by about $150,000. And it's not that you get smarter as you get taller. It's not that you're a nicer person, but there's something in our society that we value tall people. So I'm tall. I had nothing to do with the fact that, and I got to go back to my university because I'm not sure they know that data. I don't think they paid me the full amount. But the point I'm making is that we have privileges bestowed upon us throughout our society. And as I say to my children, you can't avoid all of your privilege. Both of my children went to college. My daughter went to Harvard, and she was very adamant. She didn't want to have unearned privilege. And I said, you got it. The question is not, do you have it or not? The question is how you use it. Do you use it? Do you appropriate it just as your thing, or do you use it to help make the world a better place? So I think one thing is to sort of help people see that, yes, we all have different privileges. Some of it's racial, some of it's gender, some of it's height, some of it's money. But not to, I guess I would be careful not to beat people up because they have privilege. Because a lot of privilege that's bestowed upon us is just that, bestowed upon us. I had the privilege of going to a bunch of fancy universities. I didn't even realize it was a privilege until much later. And even before people, I'll tell you just one quick story. When I came here to take this position at the University of California, Berkeley, the Haas family, and you probably don't know the Haas family, but they're the Levi Strauss family. So if you ever wore a pair of Levi's, you're supporting the family's long history. They're liberal billionaires, and they've done a lot of really wonderful things for the university here at Berkeley and Stanford and the Bay Area generally. Well, I'm meeting with Bob Haas, who's sort of the patron now of the Haas family. And the university, they've already decided to extend an offer, but they wanted me to meet with the Haas family because they're important and initially carrying their name. And they have this long list of questions that Bob Haas and his whole entourage want answered before they commit to a full throttle support of me and the Institute. And so I go over there, they send a limousine to pick me up. I'm in Berkeley, they're in San Francisco. I go over there and I sit down, and his entourage, they start opening up this notebook that's like maybe 3 inches thick with questions. And they start on a couple of questions. Then Bob says, John, I see you went to Stanford. I said, yeah. And you graduated in 1969. I said, yes. And he said, that's the same class my wife was in at Stanford. The interview was effectively over. I was in the club. And I mean, and the rest of the entourage was a little bit confused. Like, why is he being so nice to John now? So things like that happens all the time. And most of the time we're not aware of it. And when we become not only aware of it for us, but when we become aware that it's being withheld from other people, then the question is, what do we do about it? Again, we can't shed all our privilege, but we can make sure that we use our privilege to try to make the world a better place and try to make the world a place where everyone belongs.
Thank you.
Astute. Because if we make the assumption that it is only those who do not belong that will shift this, then we go against the concept of belonging and stay in the space of othering. So thank you for that response. We will now move to our third panelist member, a young man by the name of Ernell Brown. Ernell works for Kane County Sheriff's Department and formerly served on the Community Advisory Board for the Elgin Police Department. He is a certified MRT therapist, which means he actually does cognitive behavioral therapy for people who have had a criminal history. And the focus is on changing their thinking and their background, changing the influence that their background may have had on their thinking. He also is the founder of the Sir Donald Foundation, which is a not-for-profit that is dedicated to supporting people after they have been incarcerated. Ernell is an active leader in the current social justice efforts in DeKalb, and I've had lunch with him a couple of times to talk about his views and his plans and his goals and how he sees the world. And I can tell you that this young man, we are blessed to have him as part of the active community that's developing and enhancing belonging. Ernell, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Dr. Powell, the question posed is, how do we describe and approach the challenges in creating belonging for community members in a climate that seems to support injustice and inequity?
So again, thanks, Ernell. That's a very important question. And it comes up fairly frequently in some form or another. So when you think about, I talked a little bit about power and the power imbalance, and people have different responsibilities within that. And I think it's a complicated question for a lot of reasons. So power shifts from situation to situation. So for just be apparent. So in a meeting around something that's happening around racial justice, in that meeting, if the meeting is called by the community and racial justice advocates actually have more power. If it's a city council meeting, maybe they have less power. Who controls the agenda? Who sets the agenda? So power is constantly shifting. There's also, if you feel either under attack or being disregarded, it's hard to then say, I'm going to extend a bridge. I'm going to bridge with someone who either institutionally or personally, I feel like is actually against me. And so there may not be the right conditions to actually aggressively bridge them. But we have to really look for them and actually try to create them. And we actually do have power, even if we don't have as much power. And I oftentimes share the story of Nelson Mandela. So at the height of the Soweto uprising, the students were uprising because they were being forced to learn in Afrikaner, which is the language of the Dutch, which was the oppressor in South Africa. They're the ones who put apartheid in place. And the students said, no, we're not learning in the oppressor's language. At the same time that was happening, Nelson Mandela on Robben Island was asking his jail keepers to teach him Afrikaner. And they did. And he became fairly fluent. And so the two parts of the story, as he did that, they shifted their relationship to him. It was like, well, we know you don't have to work really as hard. And Nelson Mandela said, no, I don't want any favors. I'm going to work as hard as everybody else. So if you say none of us have to work hard, that's fine. But you can't pull me out from the group. So when Nelson Mandela got out of prison, he went and met with the president of South Africa. There was a war going on, and he talked about a ceasefire. The president thought it was a wise thing to consider, but he said, you have to convince the general of the South African Army. Now, the general of the South African Army was a public racist. He said black people, he compared black people to monkeys. He thought that the white South Africans could win the war, and he thought that it would be a disaster if blacks were ever allowed to rule on their own. But despite those feelings, and not just feelings, those public pronouncements, he had to meet with Nelson Mandela. I won't go through the whole story, but he went to Nelson Mandela's house. Nelson Mandela had servants. Nelson Mandela served the general himself, not having servants serve him. He served the general himself. There was a couch and a coffee table and chairs on the other side of the coffee table. So the general sat down on the couch. Nelson Mandela came and sat next to him, not across on the coffee table, sat next to him. The general was extremely uncomfortable with Nelson Mandela's graciousness. Like, you're supposed to hate me because I hate you. The general eventually said, could we get on with the negotiation? And the general had a whole entourage outside just waiting for him to get back and tell him how he had told Nelson Mandela off. Nelson Mandela said, fine. For the next 3+ hours, they negotiated, all in Afrikaner, which is the general's language. The general leaves the meeting and he says to his entourage says to him, what happened? Did you tell Nelson Mandela off? And the general's response was, I don't know if I like this Nelson Mandela guy, but he can convince anyone of anything. We're going to have a ceasefire. When Nelson Mandela left politics, there was a celebration and people were speaking about Nelson Mandela. The general asked if he could have time to speak. Now, the rest of the country wasn't feeling very gracious toward the general, but they agreed to give him 10 or 15 minutes. He gave a talk and talked about the graciousness of Nelson Mandela and how powerful he was. He gave the entire talk in Xhosa, which is Nelson Mandela's native language. And Robert Sapolsky writes about this. He talks about recognizing other people's sacred symbols. Now, this story is actually controversial in South Africa because some radical South Africans feel like Nelson Mandela was being what we would call Uncle Tom. Why should Nelson Mandela have to actually reach out to the general? He doesn't. He doesn't have to reach out. And I'm not Nelson Mandela. I had the pleasure of meeting him years ago, but I don't know if I could have done what he did. But by all accounts, he ended the war and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, he did that while his army was still fighting, while they still had soldiers in the field, freedom fighters, and while they had guns. So he had power, but he was using his power to extend the bridge, to bridge. If it didn't work, okay, we'll keep fighting. But it shifted something in the general. It was hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard to hate up close. When someone recognizes someone's humanity, if someone recognizes, it's hard for that person then to not recognize yours. Not impossible, but hard. You're in a better situation than that. This meeting itself reflects that. You could come together, bring people from different walks of life in your community, and not only model bridging, but do something more than symbolic. Do something that's real and show people that you really, there are, how far can we go? We don't know, but we certainly can go further than we're going now. And so anyway, that's a start of an answer to your very, I think, important question.
Thank you. That is, we'll probably summarize at the end. I'm going to move on to make sure that we have time for everyone to ask their questions. And so we will move to our fourth panelist. My thing is still telling me to unmute myself, but you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so that's just a glitch on the computer. That's good to know. So Tanisha Clegg, am I pronouncing your name right?
You are.
Okay. Tanisha is the executive director of a family service agency here in DeKalb County and works in partnership with numerous community organizations. She has worked in the DeKalb community for over 13 years, currently serves on the board of DeKalb Chamber of Commerce, and is also a board member of NIU's Public Administration Board of Advisors. Welcome, Tanisha.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Powell, and thank you for everything this evening. My question is, how does a community that is operated as homogeneous, learn how to embrace racial and cultural differences?
It's interesting, Tanisha. So thanks for the question. First of all, no community is really homogeneous. And if it were, it wouldn't know that it was.
Yep.
Yep. Homogeneous, once someone else shows up, it's like, that person's different than us, right? W.B. Du Bois writes about this. He talks about in Europe, it's not like white people, they weren't even white people until they came in contact with and had racialized Black people. They were, whoever they were Germans and French. And so in some sense, homogeneity is already relational. But I think, especially in America, when people say to me, for example, I don't really know anything about race, for example, because I grew up in an all-white community. Say, how do you have an all-white community in the United States? That takes work. That's not a natural occurrence. There are a lot of white people. They're not that many, right? I mean, so there's some mechanism that reproduces that, and especially for you guys, where you're a few miles from Chicago. But on a more positive note, your community is changing, and I would dare say that's a good thing. Across the United States, I don't know the data for DeKalb, but across the United States and across the world, the white population is older. It's not reproducing itself at the same rate as other populations. Every serious study has looked at places that are the most dynamic in terms of innovation, culture, the economy, are diverse. There's a book by, it's called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Scott Diamond. He argues that's what produced the innovation in the Mediterranean at the start of Western civilization. But I would say, just do it, right? We're going to expose you to all kinds of cultures and all kinds of people. But they're not out there, they're in here. The university has, I looked, over 100 countries represented. This is your future client base. This is who's going to be shopping at your stores in town. This is going to be, who's populating your companies. And so it's a chance for you to grow and expand. And my guess is, if you go back a little bit, you'll see the history. I know the city is older city, but not that old, 100 years, a little over 100 years. How did it get there? So part of it is just to tell stories, but also have people learn to imagine a future together. And you could do it on all kinds of symbols. I mean, a great symbol in the United States has been sports. Some people say that Jackie Robinson did as much to help move civil rights as people marching. And so I think you can think about expressions, bringing people together, sometimes in a fun way, not necessarily always in a hard, tense, threatening way. And there'll be mistakes and there'll be tensions, but there'll also be some wonderful surprises. So I would say just begin. I mean, this country is amazing in a lot of ways. I don't know if we'll even survive as a country, but it's amazing. By the end of this century, the largest plurality in terms of population will not be white people or white families. It would not be Latino families, which people might think. It would be mixed families. That's the fastest growing demographic in the country. And it's going to sweep the whole country, including DeKalb. And it may be kicking and screaming, but it's going to happen. So how do we get ready for the rest of the 21st century?
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's very interesting how you started your response to the notion of perceived homogeneous community. which in and of itself, to perceive ourselves that way is to other everything, everyone that belongs to some other one. So I thank you for your candid and helpful response. Our fifth panelist is Michelle Nunez Salah. Michelle is a not-for-profit NGO student studies major with a Latino and Latin American studies minor currently at NIU. She was born and raised on the north side of Chicago as a first-generation queer Latina. She learned to value the importance of community to overcome obstacles she and people like her have faced. Early life experiences and her identity have inspired her to work toward social justice through civic engagement, her education, and activism. She is an artist. She plans after graduation to focus much of her professional and educational careers on understanding intersectionality to better serve some of the most vulnerable communities. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. So my question is, what solutions do you have for community members that do not physically and psychologically feel safe or that they belong in our community?
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's actually interesting. I'm starting a major project at the Institute on safety, because safety, whether it's number 1, 2, or 3, it's one of the things that we need in order to thrive as human beings. And it's actually interesting because the project I'm looking at is using safety as a bridge, because even though people fight about, in the United States right now with the killing of George Floyd, it's like, is the community safe? Is the white community safe? Is the Black community safe? Are the police safe? Are the suburbs safe? Is the city safe? Are we safe from the virus? Are we safe with the mask? Are we safe not a mask? Now notice, no one says, I don't want to be safe. They may debate the terms of being safe. And sometimes those terms become very problematic because they assume that they can't be safe if there are Black people present, or they can't be safe if there are queer people present. But everybody wants to be safe. Everybody wants their community to be safe. And so part of it is to help people see that in that sense, there's a bridge. We all are trying to promote safety. And the lack of safety is in many ways caused by us turning on each other instead of turning toward each other. And I think, it's like, to some extent, you may need people, hopefully, in your community who have more privilege and power, who are safer, who will extend that privilege and power to you as well. I had a class at the University of Minnesota, this was years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, where it was a large class, 100 plus students. And the white students, white male students in particular, kept making snide remarks at gay and lesbian students. And the remarks were coded. So it's hard to actually call them out. They were engaged in what we would now call microaggression. One of the things with microaggression is hard to actually call it out because it seems small once you call it out. Like, you didn't give me a fork. Is that because I'm Black? It's like, okay, you kind of, a snowflake, aren't you? How come my water is only half full? Everybody else got a full glass. That seems like a small thing, but those things accumulate. And so there's that kind of othering. And then there's the more violent, pernicious kind, where you call someone name, where you attack someone physically, and all of it's irrelevant. But I think lifting it up is important. And so what I did at the University of Minnesota, and again, like this was 15 to 20 years ago, I started using metaphors or stories in my class. And in those metaphors, I inserted myself, and I'd say stuff like, me and my partner went looking for an apartment. And I liked the apartment, but he didn't. Or we were going out to dinner, and he's not a vegetarian and I am. And after a few classes where I would do that, about 5 or 6 students came to my office and they said the rest of the class had appointed them because it's not important, but they wanted this committee to ask me if I was gay. And then they said, so what should we tell the class? I said, tell them that you asked. And that was it. I knew what I was doing. I was extending my power and privilege to the gay and lesbian students who had less power and privilege. And the tone of the class changed because the students were never quite sure if I was gay, and they knew that I'd be grading their papers and they'd be coming to me for letters of recommendation to their job. So sometimes you're in a really vulnerable position and it's hard to sort of exercise the kind of safety and power. And hopefully you will have friends, fellow travelers who will actually stand with you. But it's important, I think, first of all, to lift us up, to not, quote unquote, closet it, to not do what Clinton asked the people to do. Don't mention that you're gay. Don't mention that you're lesbian. It's like, no. If you have to leave part of yourself at the door, then you're not fully belonging. And that's not the kind of society that we're trying to create. So I don't know enough about your situation or about the school, but I would hope that, again, they would lift it up. And it wouldn't just be up to gay students or lesbian students or even Latino students to create safety for gay students and Latino students. It's up to all of us. This is all of our charge. And I hope that, and I don't have time to go into it now because I know we have time limits, but to me, it's not a question of allyship. The thing of creating a belonging for everyone, that's my mission. It's not my mission for you. It's my mission. It's how I want to be in the world. And hopefully others in your community can actually feel the same way.
Thank you so much. It reminds me of what you spoke about earlier, that we have to have, you talk about agency, requisite power, responsibility, care, not just for ourselves, but for others, and the capacity to co-create. And so clearly the capacity to co-create is a major thing here, that people should not just be creating safety for us, but we should be part of the table that is co-creating this belonging. Our next panelist is Barbara Dell, who formerly headed the investigation team and detective bureau here in DeKalb. And I believe as of this summer, maybe June-ish, has become the interim chief of police for the city of DeKalb. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you. Dr. Powell, welcome, and thank you for being here. My question to you, how do we encourage our police departments to reimagine their community services so they can promote belonging?
That's a great question, and obviously a timely question. I think in many ways, I don't know enough about DeKalb again, but I think oftentimes we approach the situation inappropriately. Dr. Jones from the CDC, formerly from the CDC, she says oftentimes we think about a bad apple. And she says, what if it's not the apple? What if it's the soil? And if you look about what happened with George Floyd, one of the police officers who was there when Floyd was killed was a Black police officer. Actually, he was mixed race, but Black, identified as Black. And he had joined the police department to try to address violence by the police department in the Black community. So how is it that if that was his intent, that he silently could sit by and watch this happen? There was another incident where a woman police officer witnessed police roughing up some people in the community. When they got back to the police station, she reported it. And the only one who was sanctioned was her. And so I think we have to do multiple things, but I do think there's something off about the structure. When you sort of think about Breonna Taylor and not bringing back an indictment, the grand jury, and people were very upset, appropriately so from my perspective, based on what I know. But what people didn't ask is, what are the rules? What the police said, and apparently what the grand jury says, they followed the rules. They didn't ask, what are the rules? Are the rules themselves supporting a culture, a practice of belonging? Like I know, for example, from reading about some of the stuff that's happening there, the chokehold, I think they said out loud in 2015. But how do you create not only rules, but also if you're really policing the community through a space of belonging, then to co-create means that the community should participate in those rules. The community should have a voice, not just when there's an incident, but it's like, oftentimes in the Black community, I say, we're underprotected, over-policed. We know crime happens in the Black community. In that sense, we need public safety people in the community to help us, but we need them to actually, if you will, care, and I would even say love the community. You can't really police people you don't care about. I worked with a school district here in California where they had police officers in uniform in the community schools, and it was a disaster. And the first thing I said to the mayor, take them out of uniform. This is a place of education. Have them be educators, have them be coaches, and the mayor did it. And it actually worked. And she said, someone was talking to her about it, and she said, that was brilliant. You're letting people, and this was mainly Black schools, you're letting people become comfortable with the police, trust the police. And she said, that's not what I was doing. I was having the police to become comfortable with the Black kids, for them to see them as kids. And so the things you can do, and again, I don't know enough about what's going on in DeKalb to sort of suggest abstractly what those things are, but I think if you take this on collectively, and there will be invariably some history and some pain, but how do you collectively move together? And I'm fairly radical about inclusion and about building bridges. So for example, I work with some folks who are police abolitionists, and I say, well, what you're trying to do is create a space where there's safety in the community, appropriate policing in the community, and yes, safety for police as well. We're not tone deaf about the danger of policing. And some people would say, oh, that's not my issue. Well, it may not be your issue, but it's their issue. You have to be willing to actually consider other people's issues as well. And then how do we get safety for you and for me? And how is it that safety can't be a zero-sum game? It can't be a scarcity, that one of us is safe. Because if one of us is safe, I'm always going to say it's me, and you're always going to say it's you. But whenever we create scarcity and competition over scarce resources, we create breaking. And so can we move together? So part of these discussions, I think, could actually be framed in this way, but also look at, we've had some real successes. We work with some police departments and prosecutors departments in South Carolina and went through and looked at the rules that were actually problematic. And in some cases, they changed them right away, which is different than just saying, how do we change that officer? And if the police or the officer knows that this is the culture that he or she is working in, it's more likely that their behavior will actually be consistent with that.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much. I'll comment on that later, but I just have to say one of the things that stood out for me is that talking about the fact that having competition of scarce resources create breaking, and that's key. We'll probably talk about that at the conclusion. We do have our seventh panelist, Cohen Barnes, who is a longtime proud DeKalb resident. He is the owner of Sundog, a local IT company, and a proud NIU graduate. He's very active in numerous community organizations, previously served on the DeKalb School Board, and is the current chair of the DeKalb County Economic Development Organization. Welcome, Cohen.
Thank you. It's been wonderful listening to you tonight, Dr. Powell. My question for you is, how do we as a community enhance economic development, including property ownership, entrepreneurial support, educational enrichment, and employment opportunities that reflect the demographic makeup of our community?
Corinne, so thank you. And I know the fact that we're talking to each other and seeing each other is no small part work you've done. So thanks for creating the platform so we can actually even have this conversation. That's a question that obviously almost every community is looking at in terms of education. And some of you may know that I've been involved in education for many years. One of four people who created a new approach to education called adequacy, or the requirement for a efficient education. There's a lawsuit, and lawsuits and law can be a blunt instrument, so I'm not suggesting that that's the way to go. I think a better way to go is to engage the question, Cohen, that you asked, but only give two examples. So there's a lawsuit that just came out of Detroit. They used a version of the structure for thinking about education that I put in place, and they won. What they sued, the cause of action, legal term, what the complaint was that children were coming out of Detroit, coming out of Detroit schools, not being able to read. So they weren't doing what you were asking, Cohen. They weren't coming out ready to get a job, or they couldn't even vote. They couldn't read. And the interesting thing about it was that it affected 80% of Black students in Detroit. 80% coming out not being able to effectively read. But it also affected 50% of the white students. So it wasn't just the gap between the Black and white students. Like the system was not serving anybody really, and that actually helped, because sometimes people again sort of create over scarce resources. It's like, if my kid's going to learn, your kid's not going to learn. It's too soon to say what's going to happen. The case was just decided this summer, and Michigan is now trying to figure out how to move forward. But we really should think about how do we educate all of our students so that they can be effective citizens and effective participate in a world where knowledge is becoming increasingly more sophisticated. And there are examples of that. Wake County, which is in North Carolina, not a hotbed of liberalism, has had a long history of doing just that. And it was interesting. They tried to do it through a referendum, took it to the voters, and it failed. They tried to do it through the legislature. They took it to the legislature and failed. So how did it pass? What happened? The business community, research, that's the research triangle. The business community came together and said, if you don't fix the schools, we're out of here. And we mean fix the schools for everybody, not for white students, not for Black students, not for Latinos, for everybody. And they did it. Some of those things may or may not be available to you, but it took someone with both commitment and frankly some power to actually get serious about that. It wasn't a lawsuit. I could tell you how they did it. We've actually written about that. There are other communities that have done it as well. So there are all these examples. We actually know how to do it, but we keep not doing it. And one of the reasons we don't do it is that we put students in competition with each other. The white students versus the Black students, the suburban students versus the city urban students, the wealthy students versus the poor students. And in that system, mostly everybody loses, excuse me. So I would say, think about, and it's interesting, like a lot of these things, education is not just an education issue. It's a cultural issue. It's an economic issue. It's an issue that everyone should have a stake in, whether even if you don't have children. And we haven't done that. So I'd be happy to send some stuff with you, how these schools are doing it. If we have the right commitment from the community, from a large group of people, in almost every case, you can actually make tremendous progress. But oftentimes what we have is sort of fighting between communities and trying to make one group win at the other group's expense. That is just a non-starter.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Powell.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. We do have one more panelist that we want to hear from. A young student, Antonio, is majoring in sociology, has a criminology certificate, and is currently the Student Government Association president. Welcome, Antonio.
Thank you. And once again, welcome, Dr. Powell, and
Antonio.
thank you for your time and your knowledge you have shared with us tonight. My question is, what 3 to 5 things can individuals and members of this community do when we leave this conversation to make an immediate impact?
Great. So first of all, you have, I think, again, I don't know you. I'm getting to know you, and it seems delightful. But it seems to me obviously you've brought together a number of people who are committed to this. So this needs a container. The thing about creating belonging, we can treat someone with respect. We can see someone. We can extend our privilege to someone. So if someone is being abused or misused, we can do all of those things. But to do this at the scale that we really need to do it requires several containers. It requires someone holding this, someone saying, we're going to do this and we're going to bring people together. So for example, Cohen just asked about education. And I know I just touched on that. And then literally I've written a book about education, and there's a ton of stuff that we didn't talk about. So you could say, here's the thing, we're going to create, and I hope you would, we're going to create a belonging council. We're going to start having these belonging circles. We're going to ask the pastor to sort of be involved. We're going to ask the economist or the businessman to be involved. We're going to create physical space. We're going to look at, does our space, we do this, for example, with disability. We do it because the law requires us to do it, right? And so is this place accessible? Can a person with disability get in? And I know, again, there's historical tensions between the city and the university. How do you actually create a practice where that's different? And how do you make sure that people who are in school and people who have been out of school a long time, how do you actually put them in conversation with each other so that their concerns are actually put on the table and they're solved collectively? So I would say some effort to create someone or some group of ones need to hold this and say, we're gonna make DeKalb and Northern Illinois University, it's an exemplary of this practice. And you already started. I mean, I started off by saying diversity, equity, and inclusion is good, but it's not, it could be better. So how do you make it better? And I have many ideas. I'd be happy to share them with you. When in talking to people at Rockford, and they talked about wanting to become a belonging city, that could be a very serious process. It takes commitment, it takes time, and probably even takes some money. But the first thing it takes is intentionality, commitment on people's heart and mind to actually do it. And the last thing I'll say is that when you're talking about serious change, it's both moving towards something and moving away from some things. So you can't keep doing everything as you've been doing them and think you're gonna get a radically different outcome. Some of those things have to be on the table.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. We're going to shift the conversation based on time right now. I'm hearing an echo in the background.
Yeah, I'm hearing it as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to shift the conversation right now to entertain a few of the questions that have come into us online. We have a large volume of questions and we have a little bit of time. So we're actually only going to select about 2 or 3, but we want to make sure that people know that your questions, we're going to seek answers for them at a future date. This one is more of a practical application. This person writes, as a teacher in the DeKalb School District, how can I break down some of the barriers that dehumanize our students? For example, I hear some of my white colleagues say about Black students, they won't do it, they can't do it. How do we move forward to try to break down these barriers?
Well, there was a question earlier about privilege. And I mean, there are many things. I mean, I'm one of the people who pushed out the implicit association test. And then I felt like it was frankly being misused because you can't do a single training and fix implicit bias. What it really is a diagnostic. It helps people see that there are biases, and then you have to create policies and structures and conditions to actually change the bias. The training itself doesn't do that. In a school district, I would think that, again, leadership matters. So the superintendent of schools, the principals, to say, this is what we are, this is who we are. And we're going to help support all of our teachers, parents, and students to get there. We are schools where everyone belongs, where we believe everyone can learn. And if they're having, I just taught this in class earlier this week, basically saying, if you look at the Detroit case, what the legislature said is that these kids are not learning because the kids don't want to learn. Well, that's the narrative. The narrative is important. The narrative affects how we believe things. So if you believe, and we have a long narrative that Black kids don't learn, that Latinos don't care, and we have to disrupt that. We have to have a different narrative. And when you believe that, it lets you off the hook. They're not learning because they can't learn. As opposed to, you know, I say to my students, if I say something and no one gets it, it's on me. I'm not teaching. It's not that you're not learning. I'm not teaching. So I would really try to help the teachers get to that place. And if they couldn't get there, I would help them find another job. If you don't believe the children can learn, I mean, literally, you've seen cases, I don't know if you've seen these, but there have been teachers. There was a teacher who they tried to call her back in the classroom, and she said she couldn't come back in the classroom. And they said, why? She said, because I can't stand kids. It's like, you know, do you want her in your classroom? I don't want to teach my kids. So you really want teachers who care about kids, who understand some of the challenges they face, understand, most teachers, I think, are teachable themselves, and set clear expectations, but support as well. Again, not just calling them out, saying, and we do this partially with data. So for example, we looked at data in terms of when students get sanctioned, when they get kicked out of class. When we look at schools, we find out it's like 3% or 4% of the teachers that actually are accountable for 80% of the suspensions. But that tells you something. It's not that all the kids who should be suspended are assigned to that class. It's a teacher has decided, consciously or unconsciously, that certain students can't learn. And she or he, it's more often she, doesn't want them in the classroom. So I think you have to really put this on the leadership of the school and the parents that we're going to move forward. We're going to move our whole district forward. We're going to give you the tools and skills you need. And if you don't want to participate in that, I hope you can find another job.
Thank you so much. It's clear that part of what you had said in the beginning that we want to reiterate, that you have just reiterated in answering this question, is that we have to come with our full self and create something where we all belong. And the way to do that, the way to create space, is in the stories that we tell. And so clearly the teachers need to change that narrative. We had another question that was really specific to DeKalb that I wanted to share right now that came in from the participants. And it says this: since DeKalb was a sundown town in the past, how important is it that we confront this past, raise it up, and have a reconciliation event?
Well, I think it's always important. Our histories live in us. They live in us in our bodies. They live in our structures. They live in our attitudes. And if we don't face them, again, James Baldwin says, not everything that we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced. And so we have to face it. And if people say, well, that was then, we have moved beyond, then have you? When did you move beyond? Was it last week? Was it 10 years ago? I live in the Bay Area. When we do housing, look at the history of housing. So for example, if you look at racially exclusionary covenants, restrictive covenants and deeds that kept Blacks out, those are the areas in the Bay Area that's still the whitest areas, even though those covenants have not been enforced technically for 50 years. But the history of that still lives today. And so part of it is just, I think it's, I'm an educator, so I believe knowledge is important and it's good. So let's talk about our history. Let's talk about our present, and let's talk about our future. And so what is the impact of our history? I would make that a real question. You started off by saying you're on Native American land. Okay, so where are the Native Americans? Where'd they go? They're not there, I assume. Where'd they go? We need to know that. And it's not to make someone feel guilty. And again, someone may feel like, I wasn't here. Why am I having to learn that? And I say the same reason you need to learn about the war with England, Revolutionary War. The same reason you need to learn about World War I. You weren't there. Why do we need to learn about it? Our history lives in us. It lives in our structures. It lives in our values. And we need to understand that so we can move forward.
Thank you so much. For our last 3 minutes, I really want to express our gratitude to you, Dr. Powell. This is a very important moment in the history of our community. We have learned so much. I think one of my key takeaways is that we have to be intentional about creating a belonging community. We have to come with our full selves and ready to create something where we all belong. We have to recognize that we all belong. We've got to change the narratives that we have been sharing. We have got to pay attention to who is responsible for narratives and recognize that all of our voices matter. We have got to be able to join together and co-create. That breaking is something that unfortunately has been normative for us for most of our existence. And that bridging is something that we engage in, but only with those who we choose to belong to, and we other the rest. And so we have to intentionally change that practice. So thank you so much. I'm grateful that we have prioritized this crucial step in our understanding of belonging, and it provides us a powerful framework that would move our community forward together. We would also like to thank NIU President Lisa Freeman for her leadership and continued support of community dialogue, community partnerships, and inclusion. We want to say thank you to our panelists, our 8 panelists, but also to the larger planning committee that included students, community members, and agencies for their work in planning this event. We do want to express a special gratitude to Monique Bernotti, and who is the Academic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion member of that team, and also to Jennifer Gross, who is NIU's Division of Outreach, Engagement, and Regional Development Representative, as well as to Shaw Media, a sponsor for tonight's event. Many of you have been asking for whether or not there will be a recording available to you, and I've just been informed that you will. The recording is going to be available on the cityofdekalb.com/belonging website and on go.niu.edu/belonging website. Pretty much the websites that you signed up for or you connected with, you can access a recording. We talked about the surveys that will be sent out. Those surveys will also be sent out and may actually be sent out this evening to registrants or as early as tomorrow. I forgot to thank Mayor Jerry Smith, the mayor of our city, for his contribution and the city's participation. In the meantime, we ask that we continue this conversation online. using hashtag belonging DeKalb. Thank you so much.
Thank you.